You guys, we are really getting into it today. Join me as I sit down with author of Progressive Prejudice, Exposing the Devouring Mother, author Leslie Corbly, who started her education in journalism and then became a lawyer and wrote this book as an expose on the archetype of the devouring mother as it shows up in leftist politics. She's going to examine how Donald Trump won the 2024 election despite the growing voting bloc of white women who are usually highly educated but lack a lot of common sense when it comes to politics, and how that shows up specifically in parenting. And this book does what all the best content does. It spurs further questioning. So I learned more than I did from reading the book the first time through this conversation. So I very much enjoyed myself, and I want you to come along with this conversation because we had a great time and we really got into it. So we'll see you soon. So Leslie, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Rebranding Motherhood. I so appreciate it. Tell us a bit about your background professionally.
Yeah, so I have a fairly diverse background professionally. I graduated undergrad with a journalism degree with an emphasis in public relations, and I did utilize that degree while I was in college. So I wrote for newspapers while I was in college a lot, including the Deseret News. I did an internship in Salt Lake, West Jordan. There's all these little suburbs around Salt Lake City. And so I did journalism for a while and ultimately decided to go to law school, which I had wanted to go to law school since I was 12. So that was always sort of my preferred path. I was doing privacy policy analysis for a libertarian think tank. And so that involved assisting in drafting legislation and researching to protect privacy rights in the digital era. So I was drafting legislation, doing research, and lobbying for a while before I ended up in family law. That's what I currently practice.
Tell us about the concept of your book, Progressive Prejudice.
It's hard to crystallize exactly when it would have come together in the finalized concept, but I would say the idea has been around since I was in early college. I had this inkling that I should write about my experiences when I was pretty young, and I held off on that because I thought, well, it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever seen the Jordan Peterson clip where he talks about, what do you know? You're 18. I definitely had that thought cross my mind. It doesn't seem maybe like the appropriate time for you to be putting pen to paper, maybe process some of these events in a different setting before taking that kind of a step. And so I would say when I started seriously considering writing would have been 2 to 3, maybe 2 to 4 years after I graduated law school, when I started to think I could probably get a manuscript together and this would have more benefit to the public than it would have prior.
So speaking more into the content of your book, what do you think, what's the biggest lie you would say modern culture is telling about women?
I would say if I could condense it into one thing, it's the idea that womanhood itself, being a woman in the full sort of breadth and depth of that, is somehow weakness. I think we really struggle as a culture to understand how the vulnerability of being a woman can also be empowering. And that's because vulnerability, unfortunately, in a broken world is often exploited. And so I think that there's a temptation to think of vulnerability as weakness, and I do not believe they're the same thing. I think vulnerability can be incredibly strong, right? I mean, you think of something as simple as some simple virtues, like courage. Courage, you can't really have courage, I don't believe, without vulnerability, because you're not courageous if you're never afraid or if there's nothing that you want to protect. Courage presupposes that there's something you're attempting to protect, essentially. And so I think femininity and being a woman has become is a lot of ways synonymous with victimhood. And I think that is incredibly dangerous, and I don't believe it's true. But I think, especially when you look at some of the transgender ideologies and elements of that are coming out now, you can more starkly see how femininity is bastardized and associated with being weak and with being a victim. And I think that's why some men, frankly, want to escape what they perceive as the agency and responsibility of manhood by donning femininity.
I see. What would you say is a sort of false mercy that's embedded into the culture when we do treat women perhaps as defective men?
I think that we tend to infantilize them as a result. And I think that false mercy comes into play when women, I think, behave in cruel ways that don't look like the way a man would behave when they're being cruel, we tend to remove their agency from them, right? You didn't mean to We're going to give you grace despite you maybe not even deserving it. And that's not to say you look at women and you presume bad motives. It's just to say that men and women don't historically have the same incentives to engage in the same type of poor behavior. And so if a woman were to want to engage in, I don't know, more violent behavior, right? What's the old stereotype? A woman's method of murder is poison, right? There's a reason for that. It's not because, men or women are inherently better or worse from a moral standpoint. It's what methods are going to achieve the result that the individual seeks when they're trying to act out something either good or bad. And so, yeah, I think the false mercy comes into play where we presume women have good intent that we might not presume of a man.
Speaking of Jordan Peterson, he's commented famously about women's form of aggression being social annihilation. And I see that woven through your book. So tell the audience a little bit more about the title, Progressive Prejudice, and what that means in relation to what you are noticing happening politically and how women are being used.
Sure. So the idea behind progressive prejudice was sort of to play on themes that are both innate to being a human and also somewhat provocative in the progressive realm. And the idea being that progressives talk a lot about not wanting to engage in prejudice. And I think that there's a problem with that. The most fundamental problem is no one's beyond prejudice. The idea being that if you transcended prejudice, you're seeing perfectly, right? So you're able to judge everyone accurately as they actually are. And of course, no one can do that. And so the progressive ideologies that focus a lot on prejudice, what they're really doing is they're narrowly focusing on the types of prejudice that they perceive as the most problematic. So they're rank ordering prejudice, right? We're concerned most about these types of prejudices that we see on the other side. I think they're very poor at introspection as it comes. So who stands on the margins of progressive society? We understand somewhat, right? You have the stereotypical white cisgendered male. Everyone sort of knows progressives hate that. But there's not a lot of, I don't think, depth to our understanding of what it would look like to live in a progressive society and feel maligned. And that was one of the things I was attempting to speak to with the book, was that progressives wander around, frankly, all kinds of cultural spaces and say things that are heinously offensive, aggressive, that could be taken horribly by people they're speaking to, and they can't see that because there's these blinders on. They're not even aware that the person in front of them could be a victim in any way because their ideology is so focused on oppressor, oppressed, and having these neat textbook ideas of who is a perpetrator and who is a victim. And that's just not how the real world works. It's much more complex. And the bottom line is any ideology can weaponize good ideas. One of the ideas I was trying to get at in the book is that that's just part of the human experience. You're not going to go to any ideology, any religion, any concept of what goodness is and find people who always live that out. And when you're in a diverse society, what that means is you have a lot of people who are victimized in different ways. And right now, we really have a narrow-minded, in my view, very narrow-minded idea of what it is to be victimized because we have a very, well, I think this is all changing, but at least when I was in college, and the zeitgeist was very progressive. And I think that's still true probably at the academic level for sure. But yeah, the idea being that you just miss a lot of the human experience when you narrow it down to just one frame of reference.
Experience, and it's reminiscent of Foucault, right? It's reminiscent of Michel Foucault. We can argue that he was sort of the father of queer theory. And so in queer theory, you see that the argument is that all human relationships boil down to a power struggle. And it's such a cold and reductive framing for the human experience and for human relationships. And it doesn't take into account any other truth like charity, like love, like sacrifice that operates outside of that highly reductive power struggle. And so if you are going to operate solely within that power struggle, you are going to constantly need to be a form of victim because that guarantees you currency. And the problem is, as soon as you become less marginalized, your social bank account depletes. And so you're going to have to shift into some other form of victimhood or some other form of ally. And I think that's what we start to see you highlight in this book is allyship is just as powerful, because I can have all of the approval of the victim status, and yet I don't have to pretend to suffer from the difficulties associated with being an alleged victim. Let's talk about the devouring mother part of your subtitle. What does that mean in this context?
Sure. So I chose that as a subtitle to highlight, because I think because it's designed to focus on what I would say is the archetype of female predation. And the reason I say that is that I think most people understand intuitively that men are physically stronger than women. And therefore, there's an element of vulnerability in the female experience. I referenced that earlier. There's an element of that that's true. If you're in relationship with men, particularly historically, you did not have a lot of recourse surrounding male status. There's not much, I don't think, of an argument there. Now, again, there's a lot of changes that are coming with the 21st century, particularly in the technological realm and in the way society operates, that I think upend some of that, but that's traditionally always been the case. And it's always also traditionally been the case that women, or that children, their first reference point for authority is their mother. And the reason for that is that's the first person they exist in relation to. They don't actually know, initially infants don't know who their father is. They know who their mother is because they were automatically bonded to their mother, right, for survival purposes. And so the rearing of children somehow along the way, I think we've lost the importance, the powerful importance of motherhood, in the sense of motherhood is not just like any relationship. I think it's honestly, in my view, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, human relationship that one could have. The reason is that child is borrowing their mother's nervous system. They are automatically impacted by the health of their mother. It's not even a debate. Now, obviously, fathers have a role. I'm not trying to devalue the role of fathers. They have a different and unique and their own powerful role in a child's life. But the bottom line is, a mother initially, in the earliest stages of human development, has a disproportionate amount of power over her child. And it's stunning to me that when we talk about culture and how societies are shaped and functioned, we actually don't talk about the amount of power a woman has over the nervous system, and therefore the long-term trajectory of children. Because what happens in the first 3 years, if you look at attachment theory, is very clear that is so impactful. It plays an outsized role in the emotional well-being, development, and later actions of children. And so this idea...
And children are encompassed by their mothers, especially in those first 3 years. I was thinking about this today. So at the time of this shooting, for the audience, we are in Holy Week. And I was thinking about that today, of so in Christianity, we subscribe to the triune God, right? So the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And as I was kind of reflecting on that today, admittedly staring at the Pieta and crying a little bit, thinking about God the Father as this authoritative figure who designs life, right? And designs the ways in which to live that out. So he hands down Torah. That was very different from any of the pagan gods of that time, where they were guessing how to appease these pagan gods. And usually it was with some form of self-degradation or degradation to another, right? And so actually the giving of the Torah, I know in some Christian circles it seemed as it's this sense of being weighted down by the old law, and we want to be totally free of that. I'm of the opinion that the Torah is a wonderful, beautiful, stabilizing thing, right? Because this is a loving God giving consistent instruction that works unto life lived fully for those who are devoted to God's instruction. And then you have God the Son, right? So you have Messiah, you have Jesus demonstrating Torah lived out, demonstrating a perfectly devoted life, demonstrating the infinite creative opportunities that come from living so devoted to God. And then, as he says, I will send a helper. I will send a spirit. I will send, that spirit that in Genesis hovered over the earth, and that will help kind of guide you. And I was thinking, there is no other relationship on earth that can kind of whisper that closely to that type of relationship, but with a mother and her baby and her child, because there is this, I bring you into the world, I show you what it's like to live, what kind of rules we play by. She's such a huge facilitator in social rules and socializing a child, and being some of their first introduction to even as we'll get into, political convictions, but much more than that. And then she demonstrates adulthood to them. She demonstrates love. She demonstrates discipline. She demonstrates so many things. We see babies constantly. They're right.
I mean, you see videos of this now online where the child can smell the mother and then they calm themselves. So they
Right.
learn that there's a sense of safety, I think, that's really difficult to replicate if you don't have a mother.
Actually, when they are in those first few days, they're bonding.
Yes, it's
And then
unbelievable.
attachment happens, and then attunement happens. And that's where I was thinking about the Holy Spirit as this third part of this is there's an essence that develops between mother and child that is, it's eternal.
Well,
And
it
so,
follows you,
yeah,
and that's why I think that there's a unique wounding that occurs that we're really
right.
poor at talking about when it comes to mothers. Again, we talk, I think, better in my view about, maybe not better is the right word, because I think the discourse around mothers and postpartum is so broken. And one of the things is fascinating. So I actually wrote most of the book when I was postpartum, which was maybe not the best call in hindsight, but I did do a lot happening. This is like a lot going on. I at some point writing some chapters like having night sweats. It was just,
Sure.
I'm like, here we are. But what fascinated me as I was doing that was that we don't talk a lot about the ways in which a woman, because let me back up. There's a lot of discourse around how men should speak to women, and how when they speak in a degrading way or they say things that are insensitive, that they should learn how to not do that. And I think that's actually a good thing by and large, right? Now, obviously, within the broad contours of society, that there's all kinds of ways in which people can engage. I'm not someone of the opinion that all crass speech is inherently derogatory. But what I find fascinating is that that same rule somehow does not apply when it relates to women talking about their children, particularly when they're in the postpartum period. I think it's very normalized, particularly, I would argue more so in progressive cultures, to be very comfortable speaking of your children as if their needs were burdens, as if they ruined your life, as if there's something about them where their existence caused you pain. It's not like the child like randomly invaded your home. Like, I mean, you created the child. Like this, the child had nothing to do with that. And then they come into this world, and of course they're infants. They cry. That's what infants do. Like, did you not think that that was what was going to happen when you had a child? Now, I'm not trying to say women don't need help postpartum. My point is that there doesn't even seem to be a discourse around, I mean, and I particularly noticed this. I mean, I noticed it growing up as a kid because of my own situation that's written about in the book, but I really noticed it postpartum because it's not uncommon, I think, for women to bond in that way. And I was very grossed out by any attempt to draw me into conversations where I may be encouraged to say something about my son that was anything other than, oh my gosh, I'm so, like, I love that he's here, I mean, of course, like, does anyone want to wake up however many times per night? Like, of course that's exhausting.
Yeah, what it's akin to is those girls in the bathroom at the bar who bond over having way too many of those fruity cocktails, and suddenly they're best friends and they're all going to get brunch, and none of it actually materializes, because if what bonds you is gossiping about your kids in the worst way, or what bonds you is the sort of grotesque speech that does not embolden you to go home and be the best person you can be with any like meat to it, right? I'm not talking about just fluff, some influencer talking to the camera who has no idea who you are, who just says something flattering to you. I'm talking about real relationships that use words to help guide her through these tough moments postpartum. It's not worth it. Those relationships, that discourse, it's not worth it. And it shows up because not only do our children hear them, other women hear them.
They do, and I think it makes people unnecessarily terrified of pregnancy and postpartum. I mean, it's funny because in my early 20s, it's fascinating because I never thought I would have children at all. That was not on my radar. That was not on my radar in my early 20s. It was not even on my radar for. And then I decided, I'll do this, and I did not think pregnancy was nearly as horrible as it had been presented to me at all. I really do think there's a way to balance not whitewashing it with also not encouraging, I mean, understanding there's a human on the other side of it. Like, when you talk to your child about I think a woman has an outsized role in this. Mothers are the ones that tend to shape the narrative of their child's life in ways that I think are naturally not something a father can't talk about what you were like in utero. He doesn't have a womb. This is not something he talks about. But women do. They'll talk about what you were like in utero. They'll talk about your very earliest moments when you were most vulnerable. And there seems to be not a lot of discourse around you talking about that in a way that's sensitive to how the child would experience that narrative. You don't have to whitewash it to do that. So I think you can be quite honest about if you have a baby that's very colicky or whatever, that yeah, this was a really tough time. That doesn't, I don't think, have to come out in a way that is demeaning to the child. And I think that there's a lot of tolerance towards using language that frankly could demean children, and we just brush it off as women aren't supported enough postpartum. And I think that both of those things can be true. Women can be not supported enough postpartum. I actually agree with that, particularly in the modern era where childbirth is not really, I don't think, viewed with enough respect. So I agree that there's a whole host of problems there. Right. But I don't think that that means that you can just speak about children however you choose and say, oh, well, women aren't supported enough, so I can say I'm in hell because I had a kid. I think that that's really, it's just derogatory. And I think it's gross, and I think that I was very appalled and very, very put off by any attempt to engage in that because, and part of that was probably because I did have a very good experience, but I was just thrilled that my son was born. I mean, I was like, oh my gosh, this amazing baby. I'm like just so, so happy you're here. And I do think that there's something to be said for when you frame it that way, the difficulties associated with some of the early aspects of the child's life aren't experienced as negatively, right? Because you're like, oh, I want, like, everything in me wanted to care for him, right? Mm-hmm. And when that's the case, and I think that's what we should be trying to encourage.
I think you hit it. Narrative is incredibly important because it is how you carry the weight that is on you. And so, like you said, no one said we shouldn't be giving women resources, arguably more resources than we typically deem necessary, especially in our country. But these can be stories of victory, even colic. There can be a vein of victory through that because you walk your baby through it, you walk your family through it, and sometimes you need to be held through it. And there's a need for that, right? And I think women are especially good at weaving. We're really good at weaving in meaning, in context, and I'm sure as a poet, you can pull from literature, you can pull from inspiring quotes, inspiring speeches like I do with my children constantly. And when I sit down to write the journal entry about that day that I want them to look back on one day, I refuse to write about it in a way that is defeating because these are the tales they will tell their children and their grandchildren. And I got to be honest, I want a family legacy of victory. And I know that the responsibility for that is on how I view these moments and how I carry my children through them. There are moments that are very defeating, but the spirit of the family is developed in how we view what is upon us. And so I think that is one of the most dangerous aspects of the progressive prejudice mentality that is woven through a lot of how our children see the world. What does progressive ideology really get out of owning a woman's ability to empathize that is particular to the genders? It's always a bit heightened. Well, usually I would say it's usually a bit heightened, that sense of empathy. What do they win?
I think that this is going to be an interesting thought, so bear with me. I think that I think a child gets their identity from their parents. I think that's pretty fundamental, right? It's really difficult, and there's studies about, even adopted children who come into amazing adoptive homes, and there's still this identity piece that's sort of on the table. I think that's actually heightened when it comes to mothers. I don't think should be any shock that a lot of the transgenderism discourse, well, there's, again, a lot of reasons, some of which I think are arguably physical, and by that I mean you couldn't really be a transgender individual in the 1700s in the same way, like you couldn't go get prosthetic surgery, Embodying these things was very difficult back in the day. Now, you could cross-dress and do various things, but the idea that you could try to claim you were, in fact, the other gender is pretty new from a standpoint of you being able to attempt to pull that off. That being said, I don't think there should be any shock that there's a rise in that spirit, so to speak, of like these cross-gendered, massive gender confusion, at the same time that there's a major breakdown in the family, because I do think that there's an element of your story that you obtain more in a way from your mother than your father. I'm not saying that your mother is more important to your identity formation. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that a mother, I think, speaks a narrative over you more than your father. I think you obtain a different aspect of your identity development from your father than your mother. Maybe that's a way to say it. And those narratives shape you. And the words you hear repeated over and over when you're young are going to be very impactful to how you speak to yourself. And so, yeah, I think that those are very impactful. And I don't think it should be any shock that the breakdown of the family and the rise in single parenthood is coinciding with a rise in complete confusion around identity that touches at the level of sexuality, right? That's intrinsic to who you are as a human, is your sexuality and your ability to have a healthy and properly ordered understanding of how your sexuality works. I don't think there's any shock to that. Now, that's not to say that there's not, I mean, there's a lot of confusion, I think, among intact families as well. I'm not really persuaded by some of the more, I would argue, maybe conservative rhetoric surrounding the idea of like families staying in union irregardless of circumstance. I practice family law, so I see very complicated things in that realm where you can have a picture perfect image on the front and then you crawl a couple onion layers down and see that things are pretty rotting inside. And I don't think that there's issues with that as well. That being said, I do think women, in particular mother, speak an identity narrative over their children in a way that fathers don't tend to. I think fathers more demonstrate rather than narrate in a lot of ways. I think that's, if you were to put it on a bell curve, it's more common for men to demonstrate and for women to narrate. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I do think it's important, the narrative you tell your children about their worth and about how you value them. And when you speak about them in their most vulnerable moments, how are you framing that narrative? And I just don't think we have a lot of discourse around that, or what it means to the child when that narrative is broken, or when their vulnerable moments are framed as burdens, right? Like, what does that tell a child about their worth? And I think that, I think that there's a lot that we haven't unpacked in the prejudicial realm for progressives. And I think that abortion is a major blinding factor for them, because in order to prop up abortion as a positive good, they have to be quite comfortable with a child's most vulnerable moments ending in death, right? They have to be comfortable in a way with placing the child beneath the mother in a hierarchy and saying it's okay for the mother to do whatever she wants to you. And it's very difficult, I would argue impossible, to separate that into an in utero versus out of utero experience. And that's, I think, sort of the abortion attempt. Well, it's not really a baby yet. Once the baby comes out, then the baby has rights. And I just don't think you can narrate human value that very well. I think children intuitively pick up on some of those problems. And I also think like I said, that it encourages the general devaluing of children and viewing them as burdens. Like, they're burdening the mother, as opposed to the mother has duties to the child. And the child has needs that are just like everyone else, and that they can't meet because they're an infant.
And the lie doesn't translate well. So I compare it to, if the child is wanted, pro-choice advocates will say that it is a clump of cells, it is whatever it is, this and that. She has every right to abort it for whatever reason while the child is inside the womb. And then when they are born, there is still a sort of social consensus that children are treated differently than they would have been within the womb. Now, we are hearing ramping up rhetoric of just being out and out ugly to children even after they're born. But I will say it's almost akin for me to the sort of purity culture that didn't have any compelling arguments against premarital sex. So it just kind of lied to people and said sex was evil and bad and dirty, just to try to get people to the altar before they did it. And then all of a sudden on your wedding night, it's this beautiful, wonderful thing, and it's the glue of your relationship. Congrats. And well, right. And so we see these publications that are like, how about we sophisticate this conversation a bit, right? We're seeing this on a national scale now. We're seeing people being willing to say, sex is a beautiful thing. We need to have proper context conversations that are a bit more compelling, better articulated, if we are going to win over people who are not yet married with that drive to act that devotedly to their future spouse, to act obediently to God, to understand, even if they're not religious, the inherent risks of having premarital sex, what it does to a person in a variety of different ways. And so it is interesting, right? Because lies like that don't translate well. If it was true on this end of things, it's going to be true on the other end of things. And so I think the pro choice people have been telling the truth about how they feel about children for a long time. We've let them off the hook a little bit by allowing them to say, I only feel that way when the baby's in the womb. It's kind of like telling Christians, you only feel that sex is evil before marriage, but then after marriage, it's this wonderful thing. No, it was wonderful the whole time. You needed to have better arguments about context and about application and about timing and about covenants that need to go first. And why are those so important? Because I do think we had then a generation of people who adopted slogans like a marriage is just a certificate. It's just a piece of paper. Because if you didn't show up to articulate the why of premarital sex well, they are going to tell the truth about what you were really saying in the undercurrent of your argument. And we're seeing this play out in the pro-choice versus pro-life community is we've got to stop allowing any rhetoric that for pro-choice people, we kind of stop nodding our heads politely and allowing them to say, I only feel that way before the baby's born. I don't feel that way after they're born. It's just not true. You are talking about the same, you are just talking about them in a physically different space. And so there is no distinction.
That's why I brought up the Dobbs babies in particular, because that demarcation is so important. Because the bottom line is a lot of abortion clinics were closed because of the Dobbs decision. And if you're of the opinion that that's a human rights violation, what are you telling the 30,000 plus, and I'm sure there's more and counting, that researchers will identify, who were born as a direct result, meaning their mother couldn't get the resources to obtain an out-of-state abortion, and the clinic was closed, and they were past the legal deadline, so to speak, of when they could terminate their kid, right? I mean, this happens. Now, a lot of these women are going to go on to probably not even tell their kids that they're Dobbs babies, but some of them will know, undoubtedly, and there's just no way around that. So what exactly are you communicating to those kids? You're saying, you are literally a mistake. You are a mistake. And these kind of existential woundings, I just don't think we have a lot of good cultural verbiage for. Again, because the driver's seat is not... Now, I'm not saying dads can't say you were a mistake to their children and say all kinds of damaging, horrific things. But the bottom line is, particularly as it relates to birth, women they have an upper hand in this narrative creation. They just do. Right? I do think it lands different if your mother says you were a mistake than if your father does. Because there's an implicit knowledge culturally that women have more control over the, not just conception, although that's been historical, that women kind of gatekeep sex, but whether you literally were born, because they're the legal, they hold the legal cards. And we all sort of know that, right? If your mother says you were a mistake, I think it hits at an identity level difference than if your father does. Right. Because the only way the father could have controlled that would have been prior to your existence, right? And that's the only control the father can exert. The father actually has no control over it after that. It's outside his hands. And again, I think that there's an aspect where you first bond to your mom. It's just the reality. And I think when I'm trying to think, I think it was Saving Private Ryan. Have you ever seen that movie?
I have not.
It's really gory. And there's a scene where they're at the beaches of Normandy and the soldiers are, they're storming the beaches of Normandy. It's gory. It's very horrific. It's why it's rated R. But there's a fascinating scene where some of the soldiers are everyone, it's blood. Everyone's dying around you. You're just sort of encompassed by death in the scene. And one of the soldiers is dying, and one of his limbs has been blown off, and he's crying out. And who does he cry for? His mom. Right? I mean, that's what he's thinking of, comfort and safety. And what is he thinking of? He's thinking of his mother. Right? Because that's your first touchstone with safety, comfort, and nurturing. That's why, in my view, the mother needs that support, right? Because if you wrap the mother in support, then the mother is freed, so to speak, from a bandwidth standpoint to care for the baby. And so it's like a positive reinforcement loop of, if others are taking care of duties that the mother really shouldn't be attending to because she has an infant, then good news, she can take care of her infant. That's what we want. That's great.
Yeah, I considered it a compliment when my 4-year-old the other day came up to me and said, Mom, you're so fluffy. I was like, first of all, it does mean Pilates isn't working. I should get my money back. Second of all, I get it, and it's a compliment. So, and I do want to say, this is a particular wound that you have a unique experience with. Tell us a bit more about what that originating narrative was like for you growing up.
Oh, sure, yeah. So my mother, the first word I learned was half aborted, which is a rather odd word. I say that, and I have to like almost take a pause and say it again because a lot of people ask like, what on earth does half aborted mean? And honestly, I don't know. I spent a lot of my childhood trying to figure that out and never got an exactly clear answer from my mother. But the first sentence I learned was my name, Leslie, is half aborted. And so obviously the word abortion is very, very explosive culturally, right? So when you're growing up, and I mean, the first time I can remember that sentence was maybe I was 6 or 7. I don't, it's hard to pinpoint. But I think back to it and I go, obviously as a child, you're going, well, what does that mean? It's not said in a positive light. And so I played with this idea when I went to college because I was like, well, no one here knows who I am. And so I would ask them, oh my gosh, I have this friend, and the friend was myself, but they obviously don't know that. So you just make up a friend. And I would tell my story to the pro-choice people. And I would say, well, look, what do you think of that? The more pro-choice they were, the more likely they were to say, oh yeah, her mother should have definitely had an abortion. That would have been the best result.
And it was you the whole time.
And they didn't know.
Friends would be saying this to you.
Yeah. And that's what I mean by there's a blinder. They're not aware they're saying anything offensive. Now, obviously, I didn't say it was me, but again, that was the whole point of the test. It was like, what do you really think? Like, what do you really think of this? Stripped away from your ability to perform, to perform being good, to perform being tolerant and kind and loving. Like, what are you really saying when you strip away your ability to perform for the public that you're perform your morality? What do you really think? And I think that exposed it, right? I mean, I there was not a single one that said, oh my God, that's horrific, whoa, that's like super out of line, what's going on? Most of them went, yeah, that's an example of why we should have abortion and why it should be encouraged and why it should be viewed as good, because that person would have been saved suffering. And that goes into sort of this idea of preventing suffering as being the highest good that I think is sort of embedded in a lot of the progressive ideology. This idea that the more pain you experience, somehow that makes you... It's weird because victimization is both idolized but also demonized. Right? The idea behind abortion being, well, you can prevent someone's suffering by killing them. And yet the progressive ideologies give so much social capital to individuals who after birth experience what they view to be as a lot of marginalization and pain. And so it's this weird cognitive dissonance that I think it permeates the progressive worldview. It makes not a lot of sense. Right. But there's not, I think it's that the progressive struggle with how do you transcend suffering rather than either living in it and that giving you social capital or preventing it by either euthanizing yourself or aborting. Those are, I think, much more common in progressive cultures to be championed.
I think transcending suffering offers a different kind of elevation. One that is apples to oranges to the power dynamics we discussed earlier. And so I don't think it makes a lot of sense in progressive thought. Second, I don't think it's very useful because it is not commodified the same way. And so it throws off the dynamics in such a way where transcending suffering isn't really something that progressive thought can capitalize on. If you see, Jonathan Haidt wrote about this in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, where he wrote about all of these identity politics camps, that they're all operating in different capacities, whatever's in vogue, whatever's getting the most 501c3 money. You can still look up BLM's 990, and it's all under the umbrella of Marxism. And so it's all at the same aim. It is just what can be utilized, weaponized, and commodified at any given time, because mobilization is a hallmark of leftist thought. They're very good at it. They're very, very talented at it. The problem is the wheels will fall off of that when transcendence of suffering is truly achieved. And I think that's why you see an emphasis on what Douglas Murray calls in his book, Madness of Crowds, self-exhibitionism. There's such an emphasis on that. And it is because of performative virtue, but it's not just performative virtue for claps and pats on the back. It is performative virtue because real dollar amounts are tied to that. Real votes are tied to that. So it becomes this power grab by those in control who are pulling the puppet strings for their own gain. They know that they can mobilize through requesting funds. They know they can mobilize through requesting votes to shift, to intimidation tactics with all these paid protesters. And it's highly advantageous. The problem is it all operates under one umbrella. Some proponents of leftist thought recognize it. That is what they are on board for, is to usher in this socialist utopia into America. But some don't. Some are still at this because it is an empathy game. So if you don't mind me asking, did you ever find out what that term meant for you specifically?
Gosh, I mean, not really. I know that there's so many, I'm sure, challenging things well before I was even born or conceived from an interpersonal familial standpoint that I think fed into her narrative. But she had this whole victimization, narrative of, and she would say things that are fascinating in hindsight, like, oh, the doctors didn't cut your cord too early. I wasn't able to bond with you appropriately. So it was really unclear whether she was saying something occurred that destroyed the mother-child bond. Certainly the way she narrated it was there's something wrong with you. And that was very much the weaponization of that throughout my childhood, was very much, I think I put in the book, if I missed math problems too much, it was, well, I just never expected much from you because you were half aborted. Right. So this idea that rather than focusing, because I think that early bonding experiences with a mother are very important with a mother and child. But again, that's distinct from how do you speak about the child and the mother-child. This wasn't, framed as, oh my goodness, the doctor did this and I was so upset that I worked so hard to try to bond with you better because for a few days, however long, that was tough. This became towards the child, right? As there's something problematic about you specifically. And so I think that there were probably, I'm sure, all kinds of mixed truths going on in there, and who knows what's going on in her psyche that's making her do and think and behave in these kind of ways. Obviously there's, I think, a degree of predation going on there. And a degree of not wanting to be accountable in any way for repairing the bond. It's easier to say this doctor half aborted you than it is to take ownership of how you parent your child well. But I think that for me, what growing up was more palpable in a way, there's this sort of secret I have in a way about myself that will make a good chunk of society view me very negatively, right? Not just negatively in the sense of morally, but negative existentially. And let me be clear by that. Morally negative would be you've done something wrong, right? You've transgressed in some way, such that we now don't view you as moral because of your actions. This was more, there's something about you that's outside your control that existentially puts you in a different category. Inherently. And so with that, I do think comes this drive towards, in some ways, always feeling like you're never good enough. And like you have to prove your worth because there's this sort of constant nagging in the back of your head of, if someone knew where I'm from, not just would they think I'm a good person, but would they think that I should inhabit the same room that they can inhabit.
How did this show up when you were meeting, say, your husband or becoming a mother yourself?
Absolutely showed up everywhere. I mean, it took a long time to unpack, I would say, for sure. I mean, eventually, I got there, but it took a long time to unpack. I would say I was past it for the most part by the time I had a child. Things pop up. I'm sure you've been postpartum. It's a very tumultuous time in a way, as far as like hormonally. But I felt very prepared to handle that. At no point did I feel overwhelmed by emotions from the past when I was postpartum. That just wasn't part of my experience at all. And that was really, I think, empowering in a way. I mean, again, I wrote most of the book postpartum. I don't think I would have been able to do that if I had been too engrossed by negativity from the past. But it took most of my 20s. And that was one big reason I never thought I was going to have children, because I just didn't think I would ever, am I ever going to be... I was very, very intentional about wanting to be in a place where I knew I could mother well. I did not want to be in a position... I didn't feel like it was right to pass down unresolved pain to my children. Like, I wasn't someone that... I never had baby fever. So when I decided, okay, I'm fine with having a child, it wasn't like, oh my gosh, I'm like tracking, am I going to get pregnant? It was sort of, I'm confident enough, to say that I'll never reach some higher level of confidence, right? Because I can't read the future. I can't do that. So I got confident enough, but I would say my concern certainly the earlier on that I was, as far as how old I was have you healed yourself, right? There's a responsibility to sort of contend with your own emotional wounds before you possibly can pass that down the line. I didn't want to pass that kind of intergenerational pain without addressing it appropriately.
The devouring mother is one of the defining archetypes of our age. So if you are going to create an inversion of that, something we can look up to, an archetype that we should see as aspirational, how would you define that? What types of characteristics would you place into that type of woman?
I think it's interesting. So the devouring mother consumes, right? And that's what the devouring mother does. So if you were to see imagery of it, you're seeing the consumption of what she created, which is very almost like the snake eating its own tail. It's very gory. It's ugly in a way. It's you created it and you consumed it. And in the book, I talk about how it's fascinating because when you think of God as creator, like it really places women as God in a way, right? So women can create and destroy at will. And that's something that God can do because he is, at least in Christian theology, God is presumed to be omnipotent, all perfect and all loving and all knowing, right? So he knows everything. He can make these judgment calls that no human could make because of his stature. So if you think of the devouring mother as consuming, I think you would think of the archetype of female virtue as producing life. And by that, I mean, yes, that's children. That's an obvious sort of way you can think of it. But I do think it's not that it's producing life. It's expanding, right? So it's taking a seed and it growing into something more beautiful that gives to more beyond what its initial capacity was. And that's where I think that it's fascinating that the vulnerability of being a woman has been so associated with weakness, because it's actually that vulnerability that creates strength. Like, how much stronger is it if you can take something that's vulnerable as childbirth, or as what it is to expand from one, like a seedling, and you expand that into more and more, and almost infinitely expanding it to more value for society. Like, that's not weakness, right? That's what's fascinating. We're talking about femininity and the fundamental elements of womanhood as if they somehow cast you as a victim. And I think it's very much the opposite. It's very much the victor. How beautiful that you can have that much vulnerability and yet, in spite of that, still produce infinite value for society that can't, frankly, even be measured. I mean, what can one human life be valued at? I think it's life-giving. It's something that expands. And it's fascinating. I'm not sure if you're familiar with I see some of this imagery more on social media now of like the divine feminine. And I, in some of those spaces, honestly don't always know what the content creator is even trying to convey. But I think it's fascinating how the imagery tends to focus on that, right? Focus on this expansion and this ability to, in spite of pain, nurture and generate more than the individual initially held.
I think that, once again, this is an odd thought, but motherhood is, I think we've also adopted a negative connotation with the term accomplishment. So much therapy, so much modern therapy has done that to us, that if I use the term accomplishment, if I use the term striving, I have so much thrown in my face that is very, very adversarial to those terms, because they're tied to capitalism, which is evidently an inherent evil. And so, but that is just, it's not the way I view myself as a mother, a man in the arena. And I always pair it with If by Rudyard Kipling, which again is a poem talking to a son. But I think we can find a bit of our innate drive as humans to want something incredibly badly, to give our most earnest effort into something and to demonstrate it in public, even if we risk public failure. And so I think sometimes as a mother, it is not unlike having children, having that person who will exist outside your body and go into the world and be vulnerable. Every mother who has ever walked her child into the first day of kindergarten knows that dearly. Every mother who has dropped her child off on a college campus knows that dearly. Every mother who has walked into a doctor's appointment they don't know the outcome of knows that dearly. And when we demonstrate our longing to accomplish a good with our child in the world, we are also incredibly aware of how vulnerable both we are and they are. And so it's interesting when you say that the hallmark of the devouring mother is to consume the child. So the child goes from a place of being encompassed by their mother to being consumed by their mother. And we can diverge in that road and encourage our children.
Think of it as, the way I think of it is, the devouring mother, rather than having cultivated virtue, because I do think you require virtue, like, to, in order to extract from, like, let's say, being a mother hypothetically, or having the ability to nurture in that kind of a manner, is almost like having a $1 bill, and from that you're able to generate $50,000. Right? You're magnifying what you have. So rather than focusing on, I only have a $1 bill, what do I do? Like, I don't have enough. You're generating from that more. Here's what I have, and I'm going to keep giving, and it generates more. The consumption, I think, of the devouring mother almost is the inverse of that. It's the mother is not yet in some way safe. Supporting a child should never be counter to supporting a mother, right? Like, that should never happen. And when that's happening, something's broken. What's broken there? Usually it's something in the mother that's saying, I can somehow feed off of this child. I get something from the child, which is why you have Munchausen by proxy, which is what I mentioned in the book as a disorder, a mental disorder that's almost exclusively perpetrated by women. And it's when the woman weaponizes, and it's almost always a mother and a child, weaponizes her role as a mother, and she harms the child for her own benefit. So that's what happened with Gypsy Rose Blanchard, who blew up nationally because her mother was asserting that she had a whole host of disorders as a fraud. It was a mechanism of obtaining social sympathy. It was essentially a marketing scheme. Oh man, look, I have this ability. I'm this mother, and oh my gosh, my poor child. And the child is now in a wheelchair. It hasn't learned to walk, can't function as an independent adult, and in fact says, I'm happier in prison after I've been imprisoned for being associated with murdering my own mother. I'm in prison for second-degree murder, and I am happier here than I was in her.
Oh, and I'll say it. I absolutely think we see more Munchausen by proxy type symptoms than we'll admit to, because what's happening is it's a sort of psychiatric Munchausen by proxy that's more often happening. And I think it's almost a quieter form of it. It's not latent. It's happening actively, but it is happening in such a capacity that in a culture that is so obsessed with pop psychology, we miss it. So you see kids introduce themselves on TikToks with a self-diagnosis. It's chronic. It's ridiculous.
It is.
And it is. And if you ever get on the cesspool that is TikTok, you'll see it. It takes 5 scrolls in and you're there. And it's in how they speak to each other. It's before they even share their names anymore. I have social anxiety. Congratulations. What's your name? And so it's hard because it depletes, I think, often our ability to empathize, because there's this poll then on the other side saying, get a grip. And then there's this poll on the other side saying, no, pathologize me. But then it's happening to them by the adults in their lives. It's this emphasis on pathologization that is defeating the spirit of people. And that's what I mean. Even the term accomplishment, even the term striving is now seen in a negative light by people who have profited socially off of being pathologized.
Well, what's fascinating, because you're mentioning this, is that it operates as both a mask, which is one thing I wanted to mention, but the second thing, which piggybacks off of that, is that the devouring mother consumes by keeping the child in a childlike state. So I don't think that there's any shock that as we have a rise in some of this, like, which is frankly, I think, very poor mothering, that you would have children who never can grow. Because growing means they aren't dependent on mom. And for mom to be able to expand and say, go forth, she has to be secure enough to truly want that for her child, right? I know Jordan Peterson mentions it as the crucifixion. Like, that's the female crucifixion, is being willing to separate from your child for the child's benefit. And that requires, frankly, a very astute, and I think people really miss this, understanding of what's in my child's best interest. It's actually not about me. And to some degree it is and it isn't. And what I mean by that is earlier, the child's going to need you more. And I think there should be an appropriate understanding of that. I need to be there for my child, right? I need to be there for them. I need to be there when they're crying. I need to be there to comfort them. That's not as appropriate when the child ages, right? That there's different stages, and the nurturing, like I said, is the mother attempting to magnify and grow. And that inherently involves a degree of of separation and a degree of it not being always about the mother. Now, the devouring mother, again, that consumption, well, if you're always an infant, it's always about me because I always have to take care of you, right? There's this degree of never wanting to separate. And I do think that that leads to children having all these pathologies in the sense of wanting to wear a mask because they can't, them individuating as a threat, right?
I think it is a perverse crucifixion. So if you conceptualize the crucifixion as total ownership unto empowering everyone forever to be able to go before a holy God and have eternal life, right? To magnify the purposes of God, to truly live their life eternally, then what is happening with the devouring mother is a perverse crucifixion because it involves, instead of total ownership, it involves two things, and that is abdication and it is absolution. So it is abdication of the responsibility to properly usher the child into an abundant life, and then it is absolving the self, not ushering in an innocent child into a life well lived so that they are not bogged down with sins and pathologies that are not theirs to take ownership over. So then you're giving responsibilities for your own issues onto a child who neither asked for them nor deserves them, and now must take lifelong responsibility for them, only to absolve the self then of culpability of doing it to the child in the first place. That is what devours. It is what eats away at a child, and a child must take on the responsibility of overcoming that themselves. And it's difficult to stomach that, knowing that this is such a political fad that is happening, and it has gained an unbelievable amount of traction among women, among life givers.
I love that you use the crucifixion because I always thought of it, and I'll kind of echo back to what I said earlier, which I was so cautious about children for that reason, which was, am I passing across to you that I've refused to carry? And I think that there is an element of that that's very true. Again, I'm not saying that people should just be terrified of having children. What I'm saying is I think there should be an appropriate awareness of the weight of, especially if you're a Christian, you carry your cross. You don't take it and put it on someone else's back and say, you carry it now. And I think that there's an element of the devouring that does that, right? I'm not going to carry my weight, so I'm going to hand it to you, child. Instead of allowing you to grow developmentally in an appropriate manner, I'm passing this burden on to you.
So that I can receive 30 pieces of social silver in return. This is very on theme for Holy Week, guys. So thank you very much for joining me. I think we've accomplished so much tonight, Leslie. I truly appreciate it. And I'd love to link your website and your book in the description of this episode because it was certainly helpful for me as someone who had this pit in my stomach to receive that kind of articulation, because you do an incredible job articulating it. And I cannot believe you did this postpartum. So you are incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure. I hope that this was productive. I certainly enjoyed every minute of it. So I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Until next time. On Rebranding Motherhood, we talk about the lie that motherhood is a trap, and that if you are in a situation where you need support, then no one will be there to help you or to be a steady voice for you. I want to talk to you about our Project Loveline that decimates that lie and helps women get real help in real time. We connect women with resources, or if we can't find one, we become the resource. So if you, someone you know, needs to access our hotline, you can visit us at loveline.com. And if you want to volunteer, if you want to be that steady voice in someone's life, we would love to talk to you about your heart for helping mothers. Thank you.